Hello there. Я начну на русского, потом уже не переключиться на английский, потому что я ужасно волнуюсь и забыла все английские слова. Когда у нас появятся зрители, we have no viewers now. When I see first viewers, we start to interact with them, and they're viewers. Okay. So viewers, hello! It's Narratorica in English. Surprise! And today, Zhenya Puzankov will go with everything like normal stuff about who we are and what we are doing. Zhenya, please.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to laugh at your expense. So yeah, we are Narratorica. We are Russian-based online school, and we'll be joined today by our. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to do every week a sort of podcast webinar-ish thing now, and from time to time we will be joined by great and awesome guests and our friends like today, Emily, Grace, Buck. Please say hello.
Hey, everybody. Hi, thank you so much for having me on. And I'm definitely one of the friends as opposed to one of the great and awesome guests, but I'll try to do my best.
You're great and you're awesome.
Thank you.
Don't argue.
Ask them, viewers, to put something in chat.
Okay. Everybody watching, please, if you are here and if you are indeed listening and if everything is all right, please type anything into a chat. If the voice volume is off, if you can't see us properly or something like that. It's like a general tech housekeeping before we begin.
Yep, that typing.
Yeah, and Masha really likes if you put pluses in there.
Pluses, more pluses. God of pluses. Yes, there are pluses, so we may start.
Okay, so let's begin with our usual stuff. And basically, Emily, tell us, how did you end up writing for video games?
Sure. So I had a bit of a weird pathway into working for games. My undergraduate degree is actually in drama. I went to New York University and studied acting for multiple years, focusing really heavily on medieval and Renaissance studies, a lot of Shakespeare, while I was in school. And after I graduated with my acting degree, I started teaching acting in elementary schools in New York City. I got a job as a teacher. I'd always really liked video games and played a ton of them. And a big part of being an acting teacher, especially for young children, is running improv games with them and helping them write their own scripts, come up with their own scenarios, find places to play within a story. We did a lot of projects where they had to come up with different ways stories could go and act them out for one another in front of the class. And I started realizing there was a really big correlation between that and the way a lot of games I really liked were being written. So I started working on my graduate degree at City University of New York, Brooklyn College. And I was going for my master's in childhood education, but with a focus on educational games. And about halfway through my master's, I applied to a job at an educational game company in New York called Cognito. And I was hired as a junior designer there, dropped out of the grad program, and I've been working in games ever since. I worked at Cognito for a while. I worked on 7 different games there. And then I was at Telltale Games for a little over 3.5 years until the company went under just a couple months ago. And now I work for Gato Studio in Spain, making a big, sweeping medieval fantasy game called the Waylanders.
We will get back to Waylanders later. We definitely need to plug this thing. But the improv thing, I'm actually quite curious. Can you give us some examples of what could be one of those improv games that you've done for kids?
Sure. I mean, just improv at its core encourages you to think of a story space as a sandbox with a ton of different possibilities as opposed to just telling one story for people, which is really, really helpful when it comes to game writing, especially if you're working with branching narratives so that you don't get attached to just one way that things could go. Anything anybody says to you, you could have a million different responses. And that was one of the first improv games I started really integrating into my elementary school classroom, was someone would ask you a question and they'd ask it over and over and over again, like dozens of times. And every single time they asked, you had to respond with a different answer. Or respond with even potentially the same answer, but in a really different way. Because if somebody asks you, this is a dumb example, but like, what is your favorite food? And if you go chocolate or chocolate, that's really different, you know, even though it's the same word. And just realizing that in situations there are a plethora of ways you can react to things. So just even as simple as that. But God, we played so many different improv games. That's kind of the core of most elementary theater education, is kind of cultivating that sense of play and possibility as many ways as you can.
It sounds a lot like you were just making them play D&D.
Yeah, basically, I mean, D&D is essentially a structured improv game. You have rules of what you can do and when and why things will succeed and why they won't. But really, you're using your imagination. That's the core of it. So it's not all that different. Actually, in my experience, because I was playing a lot of D&D through college, acting nerds are great people to play D&D with, because they start just completely ignoring all of the rules and doing totally crazy shit, and things get out of hand very, very quickly. And the DM, if you have a DM who doesn't know how to run for that, they can get really frustrated. But if they're kind of in on it and willing to just play and go somewhere bananas, it can be a really good time.
Yeah. There's a show by Dan Harmon called Harmon Quest,
Mhm.
which just basically puts a lot of actors into a sort of simplified D&D situation, and they just go off their nuts. Like, they completely overact, over-dramatize. They're having lots of fun, and their actual DM, who is an actual D&D dungeon master, he's always like, there's weird shit that people are coming up with, and he's like the way that he actually manages to weave it together, which D&D and all the rules just go out of the window almost immediately, but it's still a fantastic show in its core.
Oh, totally. And I think that's a big part of why Critical Role has been such a success too, is like when you have entertaining people who have training in coming up with the weirdest thing they could possibly do in any situation, their D&D game is going to be delightful. I wish YouTube had been around while I was in college for us to have had the thought of doing that, but it was not in a pervasive cultural way yet at that point. So,
yeah,
but I love those.
For anybody viewing who doesn't know, Critical Role is a YouTube D&D series. I think it's a channel, basically, and they invite actors, but in a more serious... it's still hilarious, but in a more serious ways, as opposed to Harmontown, when Peter Middleditch from Silicon Valley starts telling dick jokes incessantly until everybody just loses their shit. But yeah, that's actually a good point, because about improv, which is why I sort of honed in on it, because it's usually D&D is always for writers who didn't go for an acting. They usually quote D&D for as a good way to start, because specifically of this improv, it's improvisation in itself, and because of, like, as a DM, you just see how the situation that you have crafted carefully just gets people really bored or gets them super excited, and it immediately gives you like the reward mechanic, just understanding of this stuff. I'm pretty sure the improv for children specifically, I mean, they have attention span of nothing.
They have an attention span of nothing, but they also have a possibility space that's unbelievably wide. Like, I was shocked how often, especially working with really young children, because I taught the equivalent of kindergarten through 6th grade in the US, so like 5-year-olds through 12-year-olds, and working with 5-year-olds, like, just total nonsense all the time. Like, you'd ask them, like, what's your favorite color? And they'd be like, I'm a ballerina now, and just start spinning around. And that felt reasonable to them as like a way to respond to that situation. And it kind of made me start to question, like, why doesn't it feel reasonable to me anymore? And are those the kind of things that, you know, when used sparingly in stories, can be really fun? Because you do always want your choice balancing to make sense and not be totally overwhelming. But sometimes you can find those little weird gems, and it makes a really, really big difference. I do think, so I recommend playing D&D and other role-playing games to people all of the time when they say they want to go into game writing or game design or any combination thereof, because what you were saying about the feedback is the absolute best, especially when you set up a scenario and your players just don't want to do it and have no interest whatsoever. Like, that is one of the most frustrating but incredibly valuable lessons a newer game designer and writer can learn. Realizing that you just need to let it go at some point, and seeing, you know, if you can talk to your players afterwards and find out in a non-accusatory way why the player didn't want to do that, that's gold. It's
Mhm.
going to help you so much. And it's a lot less intimidating than saying you need to go sign up for an improv class with a bunch of people who have been taking acting courses since they were 10. Because, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but most of the writers and game designers I know too are pretty introverted. And I am as well, but I started acting really young, so that never scared me in the same kind of way. So D&D can be a little bit more of a safe place than trying to sign up for a full 8-week improv course or something like that.
Yeah, true. And as far as I know, they're not the improv classes are not as big in Russia, but I think Masha can attest to that or not. Going to the acting school herself right now.
It's kind of sad topic for me because I went to acting school and I now go. I am in
You're
acting
going now.
right now. Yes. And I really want to make a course for screenwriters and with acting methodics,
Mhm.
I think many acting methods are really great for writers.
Definitely.
Work.
Yeah, no, I think about that all the time. So I did the main bulk of my acting studies at the Stella Adler Studio in New York while I was at NYU.
Wow.
And they're one of the, method light acting schools. So when you get a scene, every single scene that you work on, you break it down into what's the character's super objective for the whole play, what's their objective with this character that they're talking to right now, phrased as like I need them to do this, so that you're trying to get like a physical action out of the other person, and then coming up with psychological actions and tactics that you're playing on the other person on every single line of the script. And I found that invaluable, especially when coming up with choices at Telltale, because someone would say something to you and it'd be like, okay, so instead of what are 3 different things I could say that are entertaining, or what are 3 different emotions I could have, it's like, what are 3 different psychological tactics I could be playing on this person? Is there a way for me to flirt with them? Is there a way for me to beg them? And how can I shake that up from choice to choice so that it's not the same thing every time and I'm not just pressing a sarcasm button? As fun as that can be.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How else did acting impact your writing specifically? As in, what are the specific links that you can draw from the acting school to the writing specifically?
Sure. So a big one for me is I still say a lot of things out loud and record it and then write it down when I'm trying to come up with especially really specific character voices. I do kind of improv my way into figuring out how they're going to talk for the first couple of times that I'm writing scenes with those specific characters, which is, I think, fairly common for people going from acting into writing, just to kind of at least start there until you get the core of how you think that character works. I'd also say that I think about scenes very, very visually. Like when I'm coming up with the idea of what's going to be happening in a scene, I am thinking character first, but it's really hard for me to disconnect that from the environment that they're going to be standing in and what they're going to be walking past at any time, like what the blocking could potentially be, even though I don't work as a director and I haven't in any capacity in games. I'm not an animator. I'm not setting that up, but I try to leave as many notes throughout the script as possible. And I think I am much heavier on those kinds of director's notes than a lot of other game writers I know, just because that kind of thing helps me wrap my head around what's going on in the story. But when I'm working with level designers and when I'm in a narrative design role, that can be extremely helpful.
Mm-hmm. And what was the actual response from a director when they've seen your director's notes? Because what usually has been in the screenwriting, at least department, what we have been taught in screenwriting classes, like proper screenwriting, was usually like, yeah, don't do director's notes. Directors hate it, and so it kind of like goes away. I still try to avoid them as much as possible. So what was the response of directors when they've seen your notes?
Totally. So, I think the first couple of times I did that, the directors were not super happy with me. So I took to, instead of saying like, she walks over there, trying to detail like why I was thinking that would make sense. Like what is going on in her head? Like what is the subtext behind the note that I just wrote? And how can I leave that in the script so that the director sees what I was trying to get at, as well as why I suggested that specifically, because it being that specifically is not that important. Like, I don't need her to walk 5 feet to the right, but I want to communicate that sense of whatever's going on through that character's head, because I think that's something that often gets lost in game writing, is that it doesn't end up being as subtle as film and TV writing a lot of the time, and especially stage writing. Like I mentioned, I studied a lot of Shakespeare. My other main author focus was Chekhov, actually. I did my last semester at NYU, I did a summer term to finish off some courses, and I did like an 8-week Chekhov course where we were just in class from like 10 to 6 every single day for 8 weeks, just studying Chekhov, which was amazing because he, I think still to this day, is the master of subtlety. Like if you can have someone say it's snowing and mean I love you and it can never happen, that's the best. And I think games should aspire to do more of that. So
yeah, but we also have a problem of like with the subtlety. Some games just don't have the the audiovisual capacity to deliver on this subtlety. Being like there is only text and you don't have the movement, or the pictures are just 2D still images with no animation. Like for example, a visual novel or something like that. But
totally. But the more you can communicate to your artists and animators and directors what you want that subtlety to be, like if you have a really, really good idea, the more likely it is going to be able to come across, even if it's difficult.
Yeah, what's your best practice for communicating this to artists and level designers?
Talk to them in person if possible. Go up to their desk and say, I have a crazy idea and I don't know if it can work, but I want to like pitch you this and I want to see if you can help me. Don't write it into the script and then send it to them and hope and pray that they'll understand it. Like prepare them, give it to them ahead of time, see if you can build it together, and then see if you can get it into the game.
Yeah, so no ambushes.
No one likes that.
Yeah, I know. I've always tried to sort of like as soon as I get an idea, I always like try to act on it. So I either call a Skype chat or like if when I was still working in the offices, just to come over to them and so on. But it's most like this idea. Just it's as long as in my head to be kind of fully formed, but not long enough so that I think it's shit. So I immediately just go to the level designer and just talk, okay, so this, how can you do that? I need a Velociraptor on a freaking bike. What can you do with it? And then I go, what? But then they sort of, okay, Velociraptor, and through the conversation, we sort of figure it out in the end. So that even if it was actually in hindsight shit, it still works out.
Jane, can I ask you to move your microphone closer to you? Thank you.
Apologies to everyone. Okay.
About narrative design role.
Okay, yeah. Let's delve on Telltale. Hopefully, on the happy memories only. Yeah, let's start with specifically how did you get into Telltale? Because I think it might be interesting to viewers of your process of recruitment.
Sure. So I mentioned that the company I was at before Telltale was Cognito, and they make serious games that are meant to teach people how to have really difficult conversations. So I had been spending quite a bit of time making purely conversation simulators, and I had a large body of work doing that before I applied to Telltale. So the idea of making choice-based text games was not new to me. I had a pretty large amount of shipped content, and the content that I was working on at Telltale obviously was fictional, whereas where I was working on at Cognito had an educational bent. But because we were making really serious games about serious topics, the level of specificity, especially in our display text and the immediate character responses, had to be extremely high. Because, for example, so one of the games I worked on there was called Together Strong, and it had been commissioned by the US VA, the Veterans Association. And it was meant for veterans to play when they got home from the service, especially if they had seen combat, to learn to talk to other veterans, like their buddies, about what happened there and reintegrating into society, because that's a real big difficulty for a very large number of Americans. And one of the situations that we explored in that game was you go over to your friend's house and you see that he's been, drinking a dozen beers by himself every night. He lives alone. His house is a complete disaster. You find out that he's feeling suicidal and he has a gun in his home. And there's a conversation to like talk to him about the fact that he is seriously considering ending his own life, and then to eventually convince him to give you his gun so you can take it out of the house. And people were playing this with the explicit reasoning of wanting to know how to do this if they had to in real life. So we had to check this with so many subject matter experts, take it through an incredible number of rounds of QA with both just general QA people, but also people who had, been in situations like that to see what would work. Because the standard was, if we taught this wrong, somebody could die in real life, which is scary. But I've kind of brought that mindset to the rest of my work post my time at Cognito as well. I want every moment I create in a game to have the most positive repercussions I can have on the world outside of that game as possible. I want to make sure everything is done right. So my standards as far as that goes are incredibly high, because like when people are playing The Walking Dead, they're not playing it to know how to talk to someone about suicide. They're coming to it because they like zombies and they know those games are going to be emotionally affecting and make them cry. But, and I think it's always important to mention, huge parts of video game players are teenagers. And for many of them, hearing that kind of difficult subject matter, and especially getting to interact with it, it's quite possible that's the first time they've ever done that. That they've never had a conversation about sex before, that they've never had a conversation about suicide before. And you want to do that in a way that's going to at least not make the world worse. So I emphasized all of that really heavily in my Telltale application, because I could see that they, especially at the time, Walking Dead seasons 1 and 2 and Wolf Among Us had come out. The first episode of Tales from the Borderlands had come out. I could see they were holding themselves to a really high standard to try and do that well. So that was a big focus for me. And then obviously I sent a portfolio of my work. I sent them playable demos, which is the best thing you can do. If you can send something playable in your submission, especially to any large company, a lot of people won't even look at your application if there's no playable component. Or at least if you can't send something playable, send a reel. If you can take videos of games you've worked on and cut them into clips just like actors do, that's also extremely helpful. I also always recommend for your writing samples, have some that are short and that show you can emulate voices that are not your own. I always try to have a couple samples from just random IP that I like, that I think I can mimic well, and that are like less than 12 pages long. So that people can, with some branching in them, so that people can see like really, really quickly, like this girl can write in another voice and she knows how to like make a choice that doesn't totally suck without investing tons and tons of hours in my application.
I have to go back to Cognito now, and this completely sidetracked our plan, but like the game about veteran affairs, which is, I'm assuming is not something that you have experienced. And I had, like at one point I had to, I can't talk about that project yet, but we had to do the subject matter experts. We were doing one of the game main game thing, leitmotif was therapy sessions. So like we had a subject matter expert and I went to therapy a couple of times, which was fun. Sarcasm all the way. And what was your approach to figuring out how to write this situation?
Yeah, I love working with subject matter experts. I think the more you can take from people who do it, the better. You don't have to be an expert on everything. You just have to be really good at listening to experts and mimicking what they're doing. So we actually got to sit in on some sessions of people conducting those types of conversations, like for real, and record them. And that was totally invaluable. I can't tell you how many of the things that those people said made it word for word into the game. We just ripped their exact lines because it was useful and it was obviously like validated by research, and that's super important. Because yeah, no, I didn't serve in the armed forces. That's not me. But I had a good network of people that I could talk to, both provided through the company and through my own research, which brings me to the other point, research. And I know writers talk about that all the time, but the more you can research anything that you're writing about and find lots of diverse sources with different opinions on it, even if some of the opinions are dead wrong, it'll help you know exactly what not to do. That can be really valuable. Yeah, don't be afraid of doing a lot of research and putting that together. So that will help. It's probably not going to hurt you. It's time spent wisely.
I have to ask, and to sort of segue into the more joyful parts, what was the weirdest thing that you have ever researched? Not incognito in general, but overall.
Sure. So the one that I think probably left a terrible footprint on my computer for a while was when I was working on Walking Dead Michonne at Telltale. We had a moment where you ended up with a flare gun that we intended for you to, use like a flare gun to shoot it up into the sky so that your friends could find you. But then we started playing around with, okay, so you have this flare gun and this is the only gun your character's going to have for most of the game because you're playing as Michonne. We had you using a sword and a machete like that character does on the show. We were like, what if you shot a person with a flare gun? What happens? What does that look like? You're basically like shooting a firework into a human being. And I ended up with the task of researching what that would look and feel like. And those were not pleasant videos that I was watching, but I learned what I needed to know.
And you got a cool story out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, research is also very, very fun. My weirdest one was trying to find what are the exact dimensions of the bathroom stall in American Diner. To figure out how many dead bodies we can fit in there for a horror game, naturally.
Solid.
Apparently not enough.
That's funny.
Yeah, so let's go into the Telltale. What were your specific duties and we know that you've been a narrative designer and lead designer for several projects. You've done a lot at Telltale. So pick any project that you want, that you like, and what were the one that you feel like would be the most exciting for you to talk about, and what were your duties on it?
Sure. So one thing that was kind of nice in some ways about the very formulaic model of Telltale games was that my role didn't change overly much from project to project. Exactly what I was working on and how I achieved those goals did differ because we did have some different modes of gameplay in every game, but the overall job description was pretty much the same. At Telltale, more than at a lot of other studios, narrative design and writing are very much two separate disciplines. Narrative designers controlled basically creating the flowchart of the game and how all of the different story branches would work, which we would come up with the writers to make sure that it was a cohesive story. But then the choices that you make in the games, those were designed by narrative designers, and all of the callbacks and the variable tracking, all of that type of thing, that was on us. And also making sure that the sections of the games that were free walks and combat and puzzles also were playing into the overall story in a way that felt really, really good. Whereas people who had the designation of writer were writing all of the dialogue and looking overall at the story. Narrative designers were asked not to write dialogue as much as possible, and to leave that to the people who were focusing on that really, really specifically so that that could be the highest quality possible, which generally worked out really well, I think, for us. It was a bit odd sometimes to be doing that much story work and then not have any control over the actual writing in the game, especially because since the writers were the ones writing the actual dialogue, they did a lot of design as well. There was a lot of crossover, especially in that direction, but not as much going the other way, if that makes sense. But yeah, overall, I liked it. I was able to pitch some really cool story scenes. A big part of our process with that was often designers would stub out the scene or skeleton it out, some places call it that, where basically we wrote in pretty heavy detail the entire structure of the scene with the choices built in, where we talk about like the psychological motivation behind each potential line that characters would say to try and set it up, and then the writers could go in and fill in whatever they wanted to that suited that story, or adjust them as needed if we weren't being really true to character. Because that was the biggest descriptor that we used at Telltale to divide those roles, is that the writers were looking after the characters in the story and making sure that they had arcs that felt really good. And the designers, the narrative designers, were looking after the player's version of the story and making sure that they had an adequate or at least honest amount of control over certain parts of it, so that their story felt good for them. Yeah. And when I was designated as lead designer, it meant that on that episode, not only was I crafting a lot of the design myself, but I was also overseeing a team of other designers to be creating the rest of the content. So some of that was a little bit more of an editing type role as well.
I have to ask about the lead role more, because usually nobody talks about how to lead the team of creative, artsy writer types. How did you do it? How did you lead people into battle?
The better you can prepare people before giving them a task, the better their work will turns out. If you kind of no, and that sounds kind of obvious, but I think we've all been on teams where someone says, here's a scene, this needs to happen, I guess, go. And then you try it and make something, and then they read it and they're like, that's not what I was expecting at all. And you're like, well, you gave me 4 sentences to work off of, and it's 15 minutes of content. So I don't know, I did a thing. So yeah, the more you can prepare people with what you're looking for, the more you set them up for success. I think sometimes creative people are concerned about being overly prescriptive about work, but I think there's a way to give people an outline to work off of, and also say like, and I'm open to new suggestions if you have a better idea. That gives people a lot of creative freedom. I will also say, having a producer who is dedicated to working with creative and knows what they're doing working with creative is amazing, because we are awful. I mean, I love working with writers and designers, but also the process is so iterative, and it's difficult to say like, yes, you are right, it is going to take me 36 hours exactly to come up with the overall story flow, and then we are going to lock it and it's never going to change again, because that's just not how creating story or design works at all. It needs to keep changing, but you do need someone to stop you at some point. If they let you keep going forever, every downstream team is going to hate you for really justifiable reasons, because you're making their lives hell, because they have to consistently redo what they've been asked to make. I mean, that was a big thing for me when the whole like Rockstar controversy came up a few months ago, and they were like, oh, it's just our writers crunching. I was like, that's not true. That's not how that works. Like, if your writers are crunching, everyone down the line from them is crunching, because their work changes what everyone else has to make. It just has to.
Yeah. I really like the David Gator's expression, which he actually said in Sweden 2 years ago at the same conference. And he's like, every time somebody asks him, so how long will it take you to write this particular scene? He always answers like, well, writing is like jazz. I might get in there in a week, might get in 2 months, so just tell me how much time I have.
Exactly. Yeah. I kind of prefer working under those type of constraints too, because then it's like I can start to set a reasonable expectation for myself of how good it's going to be, and I know when to cut off my like brainstorming process and stop iterating and just run with the version that I have at that point.
Yeah, and it really helps with procrastination if you're doing it alone at home on a freelance or something like that. You just have set of deadlines until like you always have several nights before deadlines, at least in a row, so that you are able to actually produce something good, and there is a deadline for editing or something like that, which just helps immensely just to have a clear deadline when you have to finish. And although, which of course should be discussable naturally.
Yes.
If you like have to write a story in a week, you'll have to say no. It's impossible.
Yeah, it's like that triangle of expensive, good, and fast, cheap,
and good.
Good, yeah. You only get 2.
Yeah. And nobody talks about low quality, which sometimes people do end up with when you need to produce something cheap and fast. Sometimes they end up really, really fun. Masha,
Yeah.
how are we doing with the chat?
Yep, we have one question. Only
Awesome.
one? Where are other questions, guys? Give us more questions. And question from Lalita.
Okay.
And could you tell us what was the hardest thing in game writing and what was the funniest?
Okay. So the hardest thing is always just making sure that you're communicating with your team. Especially when you have a bunch of creative people working together, there tends to be a lot of strong personalities and strong opinions. And trying to work through that in order to be able to focus on the game and making the best story possible is often a challenge. So trying to get better with your people skills and working with others is like one of the most important things you can do as a game writer. The funniest, oh God. There are a lot of, there's a lot of really funny stories from my time doing all of this. Probably one of the ones that I found the most entertaining. I talk about it a lot because I'm really proud of it, but I designed the Catwoman and Batman romance content in Batman the Telltale series. And it was the first time Telltale had done anything remotely like that. And we were working with DC on that game, and they had a lot of standards for how you had to treat the characters. Like Batman was not allowed to get overly handsy because he has to be like kind of stereotypical, I guess, American hero guy. He couldn't be like grabbing Catwoman's boobs or anything like that. We had to make him kind of toned down because that was on IP. Also, the characters were almost never allowed to curse. We had to ask about every single curse word in the game for them. And we weren't allowed to show any nudity.
Allowed to curse?
Which, yeah, they weren't allowed to curse. We weren't allowed to show any nudity. So when we were coming up with the Batman and Catwoman sex scene, I specifically requested that we give her like a bra and underwear that were purple, because canonically, that's what she seems to wear anytime she starts stripping down. And I like found pictures of purple bras that I thought would work, sent them off to the character art department. We said, under no circumstances do you need to like make her boobs. And the first time it came back, she started unzipping that top and there were tits. It was exactly the opposite of what we had asked for. Someone had lovingly crafted her naked body and we had to fix it because that was never going to be allowed to ship.
Oh.
And I just felt bad that somebody had spent all that time doing that on an open floor in an open office, creating this thing that then we couldn't even use.
Damn.
Yep.
But actually, this is a good idea to talk about. You've worked with a lot of existing IPs, which I worked on a couple of those for Showtime, and on the Showtime. The other one I can't talk about whatsoever. And these are usually a nightmare in every freaking way. The feedback is long. The feedback is usually completely unreasonable. What was your experience working with that?
So I actually had really good experiences working on licensed IPs. Most of the IP holders that I worked with were extremely reasonable and let us do way more than we thought we were going to be able to do. I was also working with... No, I think a big part of it, though, was like the IPs I was working on. I worked on The Walking Dead and Guardians of the Galaxy and Batman. They've all been around for a while, and they all have pretty codified rules of what they want their world to be. So they were able to give us a ton of information up front about what we could and could not do. So we kind of knew the type of questions to ask before pitching anything. And we knew the type of thing that they would probably say no to. So it was just creating the box of yes after that, and understanding more about that. So I can't think of actually any point where we went really, really far off in the wrong direction, and then had to course correct. We always got told no pretty quickly if we were super off from where we wanted to be. And also I would bring up, so we had talked a little bit in preparing for this about the fact that I used to write a lot of fan fiction. Writing fan fiction is amazing practice for working on licensed IP. It is so good because you start taking characters and worlds that are not yours and finding your place within them and telling the stories that you find compelling about those worlds. That is a super useful skill. Now, obviously, it becomes a little bit less useful if you're trying to do like big alternate universe type fanfics and you're just kind of using the characters in name. That's not as transferable. But if you're really trying to write in-world content for things, that's what I do for money now. When you're working on a licensed IP, you're kind of a glorified fanfic writer. And I think that's delightful. So I recommend that, especially if someone has like a specific IP that they want to learn to write for, practice it. Don't necessarily submit your writing for that exact IP for the role. Often that can backfire in your face, partially because of licensing issues. But it's not bad to have that in your back pocket.
Yeah, almost every skills that we consider like not proper writing, they are usually the most helpful, like D&D, fan fiction, and so on and so on.
Game writing's not proper writing. I embraced this long ago, and it's totally okay.
I'd say writing is also not proper writing in general.
Yeah.
Well, these
true.
rules, they don't matter. Every single one of them can be broken.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, we have one more question about portfolio, and Yuki asks, what kind of games, your opinion, would be great for a starter's portfolio? Text games, or you need to have graphics? Lots of short games, or something big?
So send what you have, and send what you're the most proud of, would be what I'd say. If you're going for a game writing role, they don't need to see if you can draw or create your own graphics. Obviously, the more finished and polished the game you have to send, that does look professional. Like, that's good. But text adventures, if they're really well crafted and you can say, I am the only person who worked on this is all me, and this really shows like my taste and my ability, that's great. Like, that can be more useful than saying, like, I was one of the 17 people who worked on this one scene in a Uncharted DLC sometimes. Because you can say, like, every bit of this work is mine. Like, you're not seeing the work of my coworkers and getting excited about it. This is my stuff. But yeah, having an assortment is good. And like I said, put forward what you are the most proud of, what you think shows off your skills best for the role that you're going for, and what shows your unique personality. Like, what is it about you specifically that makes you the best person for this role?
And actually, around text adventures, I would also pitch in. We had at my university, we had a game jam, like a 3-day game jam yesterday. Yesterday it finished, and writing like full-time text adventure. Like I was really sleep deprived, so I didn't want to compromise with teams at the game jam, which is quite stressful by itself. And when you're sleep deprived, you just start yelling at people. And I didn't want that to do, so I just went for the text adventure, and I just wrote on my lonesome for 3 days a text adventure, and it was pretty surprising how much of the character actually shows in the text adventure. Because like even like after talking about it and looking at that, it is weird as hell. Like, it's weird even by my own standards, and my business card says weird shit delivered with a straight face. But and still, there was a lot of like the character just shows through the text adventure, just because you have nobody else to sort of inform this. Because every time you're writing a character and you're sending those specs to the artist, even on the game jam, they will take their own spin, and you will see, okay, this is the character, and it will inform your spin on the story specifically. Because you just see that this character will be funnier doing this thing, and not the one that you have immediately thought about. So text adventures are really great in this regard to show like what you are about, what you specifically are about.
Oh, totally. And I think text adventures are much more deceptively difficult than a lot of people think of them as being. Like, there's a lot of design work that goes into creating a good text adventure. And especially if you're working in Twine, if you want to show off some technical knowledge about like how you know how to do variable tracking or really creative like jumps between pieces of content, you can do that. And then you can make that really obvious to the person playing, which is exciting. I mean, I know when I've created text adventures, it ends up being like thousands and thousands of words for 10 minutes of content. Like, it's not I don't know. Because I think also while you're working on a text adventure, you're like, oh, I don't need people to make the art, so I can have heavier branches, and then suddenly it's expanding out into a Christmas tree, and you've signed up for so much more than you bargained for.
At Scriptlog Podcast, Laura Miche, who will actually be on the course, she told a story about a game where she started with three options, and she delivered a different branch on all of those three options, and ended up with a 5 minute of gameplay, but a novel length branch all the way around. And she just kept going because, well, that's Laura, I suppose. But
I believe it. Like, that's pretty easy to do. Yeah.
Yeah, branching just goes out, like, it's just increases exponentially. You can't control it whatsoever once you add another branch, unless you like have a producer staring at you or just a panic and a deadline.
Well, I think that's a big part of being a narrative designer, though, is making sure that your branches are coming back together and that you're not creating something totally unproducible, and planning for that as early as you possibly can. Like, what are the moments that really need branching? And what are the moments where you can have a choice that's just flavor?
Yeah, and tracking whether the choice actually makes sense to exist. You know, like Charlene Putney from Divinity, who was also here. She, I recommend like just watching. It is on YouTube. Our conversation with Charlene, right? Yeah, try to watch it. There is fantastic. She said fantastic things about the different choices. Your example was. You are on the spaceship that will definitely crash. You have 2 space pods. One of them has 2 last tigers in universe, and another one has 50 orphans. Oh, you cannot save yourself. You can only choose one of them. Who will you choose? Which is a great choice, other than just, will you wake up right now, or will you press the snooze button?
Exactly. There has to be context behind the choice that you're making. Like, one of the things that drives me the most crazy is when there has been no prep that there are going to be any doors. You have no idea what might be behind either door, and they're like, pick left door or pick right door. And then you pick, and it like changes your gameplay. It's like, that didn't feel like it mattered. That was totally arbitrary. I just clicked on a thing, and you completely changed my experience. Like, prep me.
Okay, let's go a little bit into the future and more into things to come. So this is your moment to plug Waylanders. What are you looking forward from your writing? What you are most excited about writing and designing yourself? Not necessarily on Waylanders. I'm assuming it's so tight under NDA, it's not even funny. But some stuff that you in general would be interested in doing, in figuring out or trying for yourself.
So shockingly, not under super NDA for Waylanders, so I can talk about it a little bit, and I'm happy to plug it. Like I said earlier, I did a lot of study on medieval and Renaissance studies in school, and I've always been really, really into those periods of European history. So the fact that I get to create a gigantic Celtic fantasy RPG is just like, that makes me so happy. Like, I grew up reading like all of the Tolkien. Basically, if it was a fantasy book in the library at my school, I read it at least once. I was absolutely that nerd. And getting to work on an IP like that now is just really exciting for me. And especially the fact that we're leaning very specifically on Spanish Celtic mythology, which is a little bit different than the kind of typical British, Irish, Celtic stuff that people know. I'm really happy about that. That's cool. And I'm about to take a multiple-week trip to Spain to get to do a lot of research on site at different historical sites that are going to appear in the game. So
that's fantastic.
I'm really psyched about that. That's going to be super neat. I'm also excited because they're going to let me do a lot of exploration with cool romance content and push some things in a little bit more of a mature direction than I've been able to go. And by that, I don't necessarily mean like nudity all over the place. I mean, treating relationships with a little bit more of an adult perspective than a lot of games have in the past, because that's something that I have been wanting to do for a while. And I don't know the exact level of this that it'll be in Waylanders yet, we're still very early on in story development. I mean, the game's not scheduled to drop until halfway through 2020. So obviously we're not writing dialogue for romance scenes yet. It's still way, way, way too early for that. But I think in general, it will be good for the game industry and for players to get to experience romance and relationship content beyond just getting to the first kiss or the first time you're going to have sex with someone. I want to explore relationships that have started before the game started. I want to explore relationships breaking up. I want to explore what it's like trying to have children with someone in a game, or, you know, losing your spouse or losing a child. These kind of things that people go through in real life that we don't see portrayed in interactive media as often as you see portrayed in real media. Like, I got divorced a couple years ago, and I have not seen a game try to tackle that in a really meaningful way, but that's an extremely common part of life for a lot of people. And yeah, I think I definitely want to explore more things like that in my work. I'm also very interested in mobile storytelling. This is not Waylanders at all. This is just something I would like to do at some point, because I think what's going on with the huge influx of story games for women on mobile is really exciting. And a lot of them right now are pretty corny and romance novelish, which is delightful and fine. Like, I really like them. I read romance novels too. Like, I enjoy that type of thing. I'm totally the correct audience for that. But I'd love to see some of that taken a little bit more seriously and with a bit more depth as well. To treat the audience like the, you know, women 30 to 50 that they are.
I recommend you checking out the Artifacts Mundi. It's a Polish hidden object game studio, which sort of kind of never got a whiff of hidden object games with free-to-play content. They sort of stayed at like 2011 level of game design monetization model. And they're still going, and hidden object games, like since Big Fish game times, they were always like targeted specifically at women. Housewives 45 plus, I think we got, because I also started with those. It was something like that. And also on the subject of romance, Ellie, who was with us on the panel, his talk in Sweden. Did you manage to get a chance to see it?
Yeah, I watched it online the other day because he went right before me at the conference. Sorry, I missed it that day, but.
Yeah, his talk is really great, and it also touches on a lot of subjects that you are talking right now that I've talked in my talk about propaganda. He's really wonderful. I should ask him to get here.
Okay.
Yeah, so...
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Emily, could you tell us about what games do you think right now are the best in storytelling? Like,
oh man.
the best storytelling games. What do you think?
Gosh. Yeah, I think a lot of people are doing really interesting things with storytelling in games now, which is very exciting to me. I think writing in games is being more accepted as necessary, which is great. I mean, look at the level of writing in some of the big AAA games that came out this year compared to games past. Like, obviously in, you know, even Red Dead Redemption, story isn't the main focus of that game, but it's much better constructed and it plans for a lot more story options than any of the games they've put out so far. The story in Spider-Man was great. Same thing with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Like, they really are starting to hone in on that being important, even in the larger sectors of game development. Although I think story will always be kind of led by the indie sector, because you have people who are deeply artistic and working on really, really small teams so that their strange opinions and tastes can show through, which is good. Like, that's part of what makes indie games so magical. I mean, everybody lost their minds over What Remains of Edith Finch last year, and I think that was totally correct. That's a beautiful experience. And one of the things I like about it is they don't give you the illusion that you're going to have choices over what's happening. Like, you are along for the ride in Edith Finch, but it's a damn good ride that is absolutely worth taking. I can't say enough good things about that game. I just replayed it again recently, I also loved Florence this year, the mobile game that came out. It made me cry, which I was not expecting from a mobile game while I was commuting. So that was good. I really, really enjoyed that. But yeah, there's so many games with good story coming out, and I've been so busy this year. I admit I haven't played as many games as I usually do. So over my holiday break, I'm hoping to kind of buckle down and play some catch up.
I recommend for the research for romance, and I've handed to Ellie too. There's a game Expeditions Vikings, specifically for romance. It's quite low key. I don't think it's got big or anything. It's a tactical game about Vikings in Britain, which is also might be interesting to you on their maybe medieval and historical reasons. But their romance is it sort of Bulges stands on the same kind of grounds and setups as the usual romance, but it felt very different. As in, you're just going with your herd over there, Britain, and for like a year, I think, in the time scale, and then romance just happens, sort of. It felt very organic for whatever reason, not unlike in say Mass Effect, where you just a set of things you have to do plus the companion mission and then sex, but more. It really felt organic. So it might be interesting for you to play. Plus, like I think it's sort of around the Lindisfarne raid, the first raid in Britain.
Okay.
It's really interesting in this regard. The combat is less so go on easy mode, but the actual conversation and writing there is quite good.
Thank you. I'll check that out.
Okay, Mash, how are we on time?
Well, there is no questions. Sorry. Yeah.
You're fine.
Okay. We asked everything that we wanted to ask them.
Well, as usual, we have all the questions that we want to ask, and we don't go through all of them.
Okay. Well, because it's almost 10 here, and I think we can. Guys, in comments, do you have more questions?
I think we can do like one question, and then it will be start to wrapping up.
Yep. We have time for one more question.
Make it good.
Yeah. But while we're waiting, maybe we'll ask something.
Sure. What have you got?
Oh, well, I don't know. I wanted to ask you so many things about fanfics and and acting. You have such an interesting EMDB.
Thanks. Yeah, the funny one was the Bruce Lee thing, I guess. So I studied martial arts for a while too, in my 20s. Yeah. And the gym that I went to was like in the Bruce Lee lineage. And because I had acting experience, they asked me to like be an extra in the background of this Bruce Lee documentary TV series. So there's like all of these times where like my instructor is talking about important things and you just see me like in the back just punching a bag. And there are a couple of times where he's explaining things and they like zoom in on my face, like looking confused, like I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
Oh, so
that was fun.
You can play in mock-up, yeah?
The motion capture.
Oh, I've done motion capture. Not a ton of it, but a little bit.
A little bit. Wow. Can you tell us more about it? It's really interesting.
About motion capture?
Yeah. How
specifically? Sure. So, I mean, more and more games are using motion capture, but a lot of things are using motion capture that you wouldn't expect to either. There's been a big uptick in it in the commercial industry. Weirdly enough, like the first time I ever did motion capture was for a commercial for Tide laundry detergent. And they just needed like a short, like curvy adult woman walking through a house like with a basket of laundry on her hip. And they wanted to make sure that they animated that correctly. So I'm in like this goofy mocap suit carrying around a big thing of laundry, and that was the first time I did motion capture. It wasn't like anything cool like all of the martial arts and dance and stuff I studied over the years. It was just needing to see how naturalistically a woman carries a laundry basket. But that's cool that they wanted to get that right and that they thought that was worth taking the time for. This isn't me doing it, but for Waylanders, I'm very excited. There is a guy, I can't remember his name right now, but he's like a master swordsman in specifically like early European single-handed swords play, and he's been doing a ton of our motion capture for the game for those types of combat maneuvers, and those videos are really cool.
Oh. Well, yeah, I thought about something like dragons, but woman in laundry, it's okay.
You need both.
It's a living.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question.
Sure.
Our typical question, I think, Jane, for everybody who comes to us. Do you have an advice for people who just wanted to become game writers or narrative designers?
Oh gosh.
Run!
Yeah. Don't. No, and I'm just kidding. It's a really, really rewarding field. I love working in this. I will say, start out with it as a hobby is, I think, a good way to begin. Start building up a portfolio, start creating things, go to game jams, take classes on improv, run D&D games, start writing fan fiction, build up some work to show people that you know what you're doing and you understand it, even if you've never published anything serious. Twine is your best friend. Start creating games on Twine, start learning how to write for them, and put that work out there. Or what?
Or ink.
Ink is good too, yeah. Or the story creation platform of your choice. But I feel like a lot of people who want to be game devs and are focused really heavily on story immediately start jumping into Unity or Unreal, which, I mean, amazing platforms. I like using both of them. That's not where I started because that would have been completely overwhelming for me on the technical and artistic side. So start small, start creating things, and don't discount any past experiences that aren't in games. Like I came from acting and teaching, and they're super relevant to what I do. And I use lessons that I learned in those fields all the time. Like the person you are and the things you have gone through up until this moment when you started working in games are really valuable and important and valid, especially when it comes to storytelling. Like don't sell yourself or your previous experience short, all because you've never had a paying gig in games before doesn't mean you're not the right person for this role. You just have to be able to prove it with a portfolio and how you talk about the things you have done in the past.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So
Yeah,
we'll be wrapping up now, I'm assuming.
Zhenya, I think that is a good time to talk about the course.
Yes, the course, the Game Writing in English 2.0 that will start in winter, 11th of January. Emily will be joining us. I think you are the fourth speaker in a row, along with Chris Avalon, Sam Lake, Laura Miche, and Jorge Tepaco, and as a guest speaker. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. There will be super in-depth, as in we'll be talking Emily's games and specific things that she has done and why she has done them and why she has done them this particular way. There will be conversation about Batman and Catwoman for sure, because I can't stop quoting her story about Catwoman's rejection of Bruce Wayne in episode 5. By all means, join in. There will be a game in ink at the end, text adventure that you can use in your portfolio, and it will hope it's up to you. But I will help as much as I can and give as much feedback as I can, and give in lectures help and assist you to actually finish it and edit in your portfolio, and it will be great. By all means, join in. I think, where are the links for this?
Yep. Links below the video.
In the doobly-doo, I think they say.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sorry. So yes.
You're so cute.
You've been doing well, Masha. You've been doing well.
Oh, come on. You'll be crying all night about my English.
Oh my God, no, you're fine. Do you want to hear me try to speak Russian? Because it will be so much worse.
Okay. So yeah, I think we can say goodbyes and end this conversation. Женя, help me.
Oh my god, you're
See
just
ya.
breaking out. You're just breaking down right now.
It's all good.
Oh.
Anyway, thank you so much for having me on today. This was lovely. To everybody in the comments asking questions, I really appreciate it. And yeah, to both of you.
I think they're shy.
Yeah.
It's okay.
It's not 20 people watching us right now, and 3 of them just asked questions. I think they just as shy as me about their English. So guys, come on to the course, and we think what we can do with it.
Yeah, the whole goal of it is just to provide a safe space for you to practice English and to ask questions to Emily and everybody else in a more sort of safe environment where it's not will be publicly broadcast. And yeah, check the course, check out the courses from Narratorica, check Waylanders. It's really freaking cool. Their Kickstarter page, so far it's on the Kickstarter page, as far as I know.
We made it. We beat
made
our
it?
Kickstarter goal, and our Kickstarter is now over. But if you still wanted to buy an early copy of the game or get in on any of the stretch goals, we do still have a PayPal open to try and reach some of our stretch goals and make some of the add-ons available. The main add-on that you can get the best deal right now for Waylanders is they actually started out, and I didn't work on it, but the team at Gato Studio started out with Waylanders as a board game and created a proof of concept board game to start building out their world and testing out combat mechanics. And it's delightful. And there's a very good sale on getting the board game and a copy of the video game once it launches in 2020 if you contribute to the PayPal before that closes. So I recommend that if Waylanders sounds like it's your jam.
And on that note,
Yep. I think that's all. Thank you, Emily, very much.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to hear you, to see you. Yes.
Thank you.
Dana?
I wanted you to do that. Okay, goodbye, everyone. We'll be back next week. I think it will be just us, right?
Yep.
Yeah, but we'll be trying to get more people to join us on these weekly podcasts on Saturdays.
Okay, so thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, go.